So Fiona in the east of our country, Ian in the United States, devastating storms, and the latest examples of extreme weather events that have many people thinking and wondering about how we live, how we build. Eddie Oldfield is with us this morning. He's the senior lead for projects at Quest Canada, and he's an expert in environmental resiliency. He's in Moncton this morning. Eddie, welcome to our program.
Good morning, Heather. Great to be here.
Well, I have lots of questions for you, but I wonder if we go back to 12 days ago, given your expertise, your mind, what were you thinking about as you saw Fiona roll in and then saw the devastation left behind? What was going through your expert mind?
Well, I think one thing for sure is we have never experienced a hurricane with that level of devastation and force on the Atlantic coast. And we're no strangers to tropical storms and so forth. But seeing that come up through the coast, it's an indication that climate change, the increase in sea level temperatures are affecting the frequency and the severity of storms like this. And not surprisingly, many of our communities remain somewhat unprepared for these types of large events, especially small, rural, Indigenous communities and vulnerable populations.
Right. So as you were seeing that, did you think, this is going to be an opportunity for change here? As devastating as it is, this is going to be an opportunity in some ways to start thinking about change. How much can an extreme weather event like this be a catalyst for change?
Absolutely. I believe that sometimes it takes an extreme weather event, unfortunately, to make us aware of our vulnerabilities and how to be more resilient for future types of events. And so I can draw from my own experience. My aha moment would have been the 1998 ice storm, which, of course, at the time I was living in Montreal, and there was a prolonged power outage, which affected the provision of essential services, the ability to access running water, communications, and so on. And so there's, cascading impacts from large events like this, especially when there's prolonged outages to energy supply. And this obviously begs the question, well, what can we do differently? We work with communities across Canada. Our organization conducts climate risk assessments and helps communities plan for future climate risk and extreme weather events. We see in our research that some of the most common vulnerabilities or challenges that communities have include a lack of alignment between municipalities and their utilities in terms of planning for prolonged outages.
Okay.
They have lack of capacity. And there's also a need to consider climate change in land use planning and emergency management plans.
So as part of a resiliency planning strategy then, I mean, obviously this is a very comprehensive file for you to deal with communities, but can you give us some basic examples about the kinds of things that examples that would make for good resiliency planning?
Absolutely. I would like to start with saying that resilience is not about better poles and wires. It is our ability to withstand adversity and bounce back. And it starts with the individual, having a 72-hour preparedness kit, an evacuation plan, checking on neighbors. And at the community level, most importantly, our land use plans, so that we're not building, for example, in flood-prone areas, adopting building codes so that buildings can withstand more extreme weather events, having essential services that continue to function through those events. When communities are not able to respond to a large type of event, they can call on the province and the federal government, but we shouldn't just be waiting for somebody to come and rescue. There needs to be preparedness at all levels. It's a shared responsibility. There are many things that municipalities are doing and can do to prevent the kinds of things we're seeing as a result of Fiona. And that includes integrating climate science into traditional land use and emergency management plans, having clear communication and clear roles and responsibilities before, during, and after an event, and planning for those outages, identifying critical local infrastructure that needs to be restored or have backup power. This can include, and we've seen examples of this, shelters, water and water treatment systems, communications networks. These things are essential for the functioning of a community. Right. And then finally, looking at vulnerable populations. So often we don't have a plan in place to address the needs of vulnerable populations. These could be mobility impaired and can go on and on. But essentially, as simply as having a registry of vulnerable persons can go a long way to ensuring that those folks are taken care of during an event.
It's so interesting to lay out, and this is just obviously in a cursory form, obviously more detail when you draw up those plans. But you said something that I want to come back to, and that is, working with traditional land use, because that's something that we heard, for example, from the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, Andrew Furey, talking about, in that case, a community like Port aux Basques, or all along, the coastal regions of the southwest part of the province. For generations, this is where the fishing communities have lived. They want easy access to the sea. They have their sheds or their stores right there because that's the tradition. So it's a matter of addressing the tradition, but still, how do you see, bridging that gap is what I guess I'm asking.
Absolutely. We have a lot of built infrastructure along our coastlines and along rivers. So obviously some of that is at risk of flooding events. And so one of the things that we need to do, both locally and at the provincial level, is enforce better land use practices, not allowing or restricting types of development in flood-prone areas or flood zones. For those buildings that are already there, there needs to be a strategy. Either is about relocating or flood-proofing existing buildings. Flood-proofing can mean a whole lot of things. It might be creating a barrier. It might also mean raising electrical equipment from your ground floor. And so each homeowner, each business owner is going to have to look at their own particular situation. But it is becoming an increasingly important issue in Canada. We see many more floods. Floods is the new fire, right? There's a lot we can do to reduce flood potential using green infrastructure. This could include shrubbery, vegetation, looking at coastal adaptation, strengthening coastlines. So there is a lot we can do very specifically to floods. But
they're difficult and sometimes painful reflections and conversations, aren't they? Because telling people where to live and where they can't live is a very challenging point, but one to be addressed and contemplated. Let me ask you about economic imperatives to all of this. Too finally, Eddie, thinking about insurance, perhaps increasingly not going to cover, governments not being able to pay. These are huge bills that government are coming out with. $300 million yesterday from the federal government, $30 million from Newfoundland, for example. And then studies from the Canadian Climate Institute, for example, talking about how costs of restoration and repair actually slows, the costs slow GDP growth. So is there an economic imperative to looking at these plans and issues very closely?
Absolutely. If we look at sort of historically, insurance claims in Canada from extreme weather events used to average around $400 million per year. That's 2 decades ago. It's now over $2 billion a year for insurable losses. And then there's also claims to disaster federal assistance. And it's not accounting for all of those uninsurable losses. And we definitely see an exponential growth in the cost to Canadians. And this, of course, is affecting our economy. So there is an economic imperative.
Really appreciate the time. It's the start of a conversation. Hopefully will continue, Eddie, and certainly one of many conversations probably going on in the country right now, given what we're seeing. Thank you so much, Eddie Oldfield. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Heather.